time of year, old familiar Christmas carols. But what I like, one of the things I enjoy about it is they pair so well with songs that we already sing all throughout the year. And then, so many artists have come along since and written many wonderful songs to celebrate Jesus Christ. A couple of the songs that we sing at Christmas, maybe not on the top list, but are still fairly what we would maybe consider traditional Christmas songs. O Come, Emmanuel, and Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And even the titles of these songs communicate a sense of anticipation. There is a need and a desire for that need to be met. And yet, as the songs communicate, we are waiting. So there is this plea to come. At the time of the birth of Jesus, the Jewish people were waiting for someone. They were waiting for a very special person. They were waiting for what they hoped would be the greatest person who had ever lived. He was going to deliver them. He was going to care for them. He was going to restore them to a place of blessing. He was going to do for them what for so long they had only dreamed about and hoped for. And when we think about this person for whom they were waiting, we might be tempted to sort of try and put a comparison on it. And we need not compare this person to somebody like a George Washington who led the American Revolution and went on to be the first president of the United States, or somebody like an Abraham Lincoln who led our country through a time of great crisis. That really doesn't even begin to sort of scratch the surface of who this person was going to be that they were waiting for. Whatever sort of political hero you might have, or great military leader, or even somebody who was just known for bringing people together for benevolent reasons, to show compassion and to care for the needy. Whatever figure you would put in that position of sort of the apex person doesn't even begin to compare to what they were waiting for, who they were hoping would come. Let me give you some examples from Scripture. Luke chapter 2, verse 25, talking about a man named Simeon. It says, "Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon, and this man was righteous and devout, and he was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him." That consolation of Israel that he was waiting for, that's a person. He was waiting for a person who would bring consolation, who would bring comfort and restoration to Israel. That's the amount of expectation that is put on this person. A people who are living under Roman occupation, people who have experienced national division in their history, they've experienced exile, they've experienced being dispersed around the world, they've experienced all this sort of stuff, and he's waiting for somebody who's going to bring them all back together. That's a pretty significant person. In Matthew chapter 11, John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, the forerunner of Jesus, he's nearing the end of his ministry. He's in prison. He sends his disciples to Jesus. And this is what the message they bring from John the Baptist to Jesus. Matthew 11, chapter 2. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" I mean, John, the baby who leapt in his mother's womb when Mary met with Elizabeth. He's the one who went ahead of Jesus to prepare the way. He's the one who baptized Jesus in the River Jordan. And yet, the amount of expectation, the level of expectation that this promised one would do, even when John the Baptist is thinking about Jesus, he's wondering, maybe he's not this guy. Maybe he's not the one we're expecting. Truth be told, many people in Palestine and many of the Jewish people that had still remained scattered around the Mediterranean at the time of Jesus Christ, many of them had lost hope. They'd given up waiting for the Messiah, this promised deliverer. There had been so many people through the years that they thought maybe this guy is the one. Different kings, different political figures, different people that seem to have sort of promise of being this person, only to have their hopes sort of fade away. Many of them wouldn't say they had given up, but truth be told, they really weren't waiting any longer. They had just sort of moved on with their lives. Now, what I want to do this morning is I want us to suspend for the time being, suspend the fact that we know Jesus was in fact the one for whom they had waited. Let's just pretend we don't know that. And let's answer two questions. Who were they waiting for? And what were the identifying qualities of this person? How would they know him when they saw him? Maybe we could ask it this way. How would they recognize him if they ran into him on the street? How would they know this was the guy? Ever been on a blind date? Thankfully, I never have. That's truth. I'm not, nothing against you if you have. I never have been on a blind date. But if the Hallmark Channel is to be believed, when you go on a blind date, you're supposed to wear something special that will identify you from among all the other people at the restaurant. You'll be wearing a Paisley ascot, or a bowler. You wear something weird so the person can know who you are. There really wasn't anything like that for this person who was come. He wasn't going to show up and he's going to have a pink carnation, in his lapel. That's not how it works. There were other indicators, though. There was a specific type of person they were looking for. One, he was going to be a king. When you go back to the Old Testament, the concept of this promised deliverer really explodes when we are introduced to a person by the name of David. When David comes onto the scene, this promised one is really sort of magnified. And what he is going to be and what he is going to do is amplified. There's probably no human person more closely associated with this promised deliverer than David was. And David did many great things for the Hebrew people. He was probably the best king of the united kingdom of Israel. But he wasn't this mysterious figure. He certainly had his flaws, he had his failings. He was not the perfect deliverer. So why would he be so closely associated with the anticipation of this coming one who would be a king? Well, you need to go to 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 and following, we read this: "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up for your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." And lest you should think, as many people perhaps initially did, that this is a reference to Solomon because, well, it says he's going to build a house for his name, and well, Solomon built the temple. This isn't talking about Solomon. It's not talking about Solomon because it says this person is going to have a throne that's established forever, that his kingdom is going to be made sure forever. And that really doesn't describe Solomon. God made this covenant with David that one of his descendants would rule from David's throne forever. This descendant would be an anointed ruling monarch who gets referred to often as the Messiah. That's what the term Messiah just means, anointed one. And it's referred to people in a variety of situations, but most commonly refers to the anointed ruling monarch. It helps if we turn to Psalm 2. Helps us to identify a little bit more about this king, more than just the fact that he's going to sit on David's throne and that he's going to rule forever. Psalm 2 says this: "Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast their cords away. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak with them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. And you shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. In the book of Acts, we find out that this psalm is a psalm of David. King David wrote this, and it expands our understanding of what kind of king God's people were waiting for. David, the one with whom God made this covenant, tells us that the king is going to be established by God, that the king is going to be the Son of God, that the king is going to rule over all the nations, not just over Israel. But it also tells us that this king is going to be a refuge, a place of security, a place of safety, a place of deliverance. Now I want you to think about this. David lived roughly 1,000 years before Jesus. So let's put this in perspective. Just this year, can you believe the coincidence? They discovered that the Vikings first landed in North America, in Newfoundland, 1,000 years ago. 1021 is when the Vikings first hit these shores. Now maybe you think, well, that's Canada, so it doesn't count. Well, it wasn't Canada back then. So that's roughly 471 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. it's hard not to appreciate that 1,000 years after this covenant, there still hasn't been this one-of-a-kind king who's going to come and deliver Israel. It's hard to not appreciate the fact that it would be difficult to continue hoping. Now think about that. If, let's just suppose, for example, that when these Vikings landed there on that island, Newfoundland's an island, right? I think it is. Got to brush up on my Canadian geography, but I think it's an island. And they landed there, and let's just suppose that God promised them that now that they were on this land that he had given them, that he was going to make them into this great nation, and that there was going to be this great king that was going to rule over them and over the rest of the world. And here we are 1,000 years later, and there's not any sort of unified government. That's not this great king ruling over it. Many of us probably didn't even realize that Vikings landed in Newfoundland 1,000 years ago. So for us to continue to be hoping that this king would come might seem a little bit ridiculous. They weren't just waiting for a king, though. They were waiting for a priest. In Psalm 110, turn over there. Psalm 110 tells us a little bit about this coming one. Beginning in verse 1 and reading through verse 4. The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. This is very similar to the parts of Psalm 2. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power. In holy garments, from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. He's going to be a king. It says in verse 2, he's going to be sent forth from Zion, his mighty scepter. But he's going to be a priest. You remember from Hebrews, Melchizedek was the king priest, a priestly king. What is a priest? If you don't know, you might think that it's a guy who always walks into bars and comedy ensues. The priest acted as a representative of God to the people and a representative of the people to God. Priests of God performed sacrifices. They maintained the holy sites and the holy implements. They provided counsel. They provided instruction. They were also responsible for the place of intercession between God and the people. So they tended to the altar and the tabernacle and later the temple. And their instructional role accorded with their intercessory role. They provided instructions for holy living that would satisfy Yahweh's holy expectation of his people. And the most important duty of any priest was that of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, when he would sacrifice an animal and act as a mediator between God and man, using that sacrifice as a symbolic atonement for the sins of the people. Only the high priest can do this. Only in a very specific way and only on a very specific day. And in fact, in the Bible, when kings or other people attempt to stand in for the priest in this role of mediator, it does not go well. But this Messiah would be a king, and he would be a priest. He would not only be one who would rule over God's people, he would be one who would mediate between the people and God. No, they weren't just waiting for a king, and they weren't just waiting for a priest. They were waiting for a prophet. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18 says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, that is, like Moses, among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I commanded him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. So what we learn in God's revelation to Moses about this promised one was that not only would he be a prophet, but he would be a prophet who was so pure and so holy that his words that he spoke would only come from God. He would only speak God's words. And whoever disagreed with or disobeyed with his words would be going against the very words of God. What is the role of a prophet? How does that differ from a priest? Well, a prophet makes known the words of God to the people. A prophet is a spokesman. It is a representative. He or she at times is the mouthpiece God uses to reveal his will, to reveal his plans, to reveal his desires for his people. Sometimes the prophet comes to confront. Sometimes the prophet comes to tell of things to come. Sometimes he warns. Sometimes he informs. Sometimes he reminds. Sometimes he challenges. Sometimes he reveals. In short, prophets do and say whatever God commands them to do and say. An amazing example of this is in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah has this supernatural vision of the throne room of God in heaven. And in verse 8, as a part of this vision, he says, I heard of the voice of the Lord saying, whom will I send and who will go for us? And then I said, here am I, send me. God is asking rhetorically, who can I send to be my spokesman, my representative to the people? And Isaiah says, I will go. Now this differs, the role of the prophet differs from a priest in that the prophet would never offer sacrifices on behalf of the people. And the priest would generally not claim to speak the words of God. In fact, that's one of the reasons why the priests in the Old Testament used the Urim and the Thummim, this fancy breastplate that the high priest would wear, was an instrument that God would use to communicate his judgments to them so that they could discern the judgments of God. Prophets didn't need that tool. So this promised person would be a king. He would be a priest. He would be a prophet. Can you see how the expectations is just building and building and building? But he would be so much more. In Job chapter 19, verses 25 through 27, we find out he's going to be a redeemer. He's going to redeem the people. In Isaiah chapter 40, verses 10 and 11, we find out that he's going to be a shepherd who cares for his sheep. In Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 through 16, we find out that he's going to be a servant. He's going to be a king, priest, prophet who is going to serve people. In Isaiah chapter 49, verses 6 through 12, we find out that he's going to be a light to the nations. And in Zechariah chapter 6, verse 9 through 14, we find this unusual combination that he is going to be one who will build up the temple and sit on a throne within the temple. maybe one of the most familiar passages to us, one that we read a lot at Christmas time, that communicates just how amazing this person would be. Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and following. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and listen to all the things that he will be. The government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. This sounds kind of like a superhero, doesn't he? Well, that's the introduction to the message. Okay? Remember those two Christmas carols? O come, Emmanuel, and Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. It was a long time. I want us to try and grasp the fact, not only sort of the magnitude of the expectation of what this person would be and do, the consolation of Israel, but I want us to try and appreciate how difficult it would be to hold on to that hope for as long as these people had to hold on to it. It wasn't a year, it wasn't 5 years, it wasn't 100 years, it wasn't 1,000 years. It was longer, much, much longer. To help us do that, you need to know that oftentimes people take the part of the Bible that comes before Jesus, that we refer to the Old Testament, because if it came before, obviously it's older, right? They tend to divide that part into 7 big sections. And those 7 sections are this. There's the pre-patriarchal period. That's not a really big section. That's just Genesis 1 to 11, but it's a long period of history. That starts at a minimum, a bare minimum, 4,000 years before Jesus. And it could very easily be 10,000 years. Then there's the patriarchal period. That starts in Genesis chapter 12 and goes through the end of the book of Genesis. And that's the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. That's about 2,000 years before Jesus. That's when Abraham lived. And then we have the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings as the third section. And that's basically from the book of Exodus to the book of Deuteronomy. And that starts roughly 1445, maybe as close to Christ as 1,300 years. And then we go from the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings to the conquest and the settlement of the land of Canaan, the promised land. That's kind of covered in the books of Joshua and Judges, and that's from about 1250 to 1000 BC. So we're getting closer. We're getting a lot closer than 10,000 years or 4,000 years, but we're still 1,000 years out. So after the conquest and settlement, well then the people, they don't want to just have God over them. They want to have a king. And so there is, the next section is what is referred to as the United Monarchy. And that's the rule of Saul, David, and Solomon. And that's covered from 1 Samuel to about 1 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles chapter 12. And that goes from about 1050, 1000 BC to about 930 BC. And then the next section is the divided monarchy. Rehoboam and Jeroboam split the nation of Israel apart. 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. In 931, and that goes from 1 Kings 14 and 2 Chronicles 12 all the way to 2 Kings 24 and 2 Chronicles 36. And in that time period, in this divided monarchy, we have the northern kingdom comes to an end in 721 when the Assyrian army invades and scatters those 10 tribes to the wind. And then in 586 BC, the southern kingdom is captured by the Babylonians and carried off into exile, which leads to the last historical section of the Old Testament, which is referred to as the exile and return, or the exile and post-exile. And that's 2 Kings 25 and 2 Chronicles 36 and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And that ends sometime around 500 to 400 BC, give or take. And then we have the 400 years in between the Old and New Testament. And even in those 400 years in between the Old Testament and New Testament, the people are still waiting for the Messiah. And there are these different figures that rise up, and there's expectations that are placed on them that maybe this guy's going to be the one. But their expectations fluctuate. When we come to the New Testament, we find people still waiting when Jesus arrives in Bethlehem. So what we have is at least, bare minimum, 4,000 years of history, and possibly much, much longer. So if we were to just sort of work our way backwards to put that into perspective, this is the 400th anniversary of the first Thanksgiving meal. 400 years ago. What if we had to wait that long? A promise that Squanto brought and told the colonists something was going to happen. As I mentioned, 1,000 years ago, the Vikings landed. What if we had to wait that long? 2,000 years ago, well, that's the life of Christ, so we're already back that far. Something that happened in Jesus' lifetime. If we go back 3,000 years ago, that would put us the same distance between us and King David now. World population at that time is only about 50 million people. 3,000 years ago, that's when the Japanese people started cultivating rice. So our promise would be as old as rice. 4,000 years ago, that's when cotton was first cultivated and woven into fabric. That's when the Babylonians came up with the great idea to divide the circle into 360 units. That's when the dynasty of Ur in Sumeria was founded. That's where Abraham was called right out of Ur. So our promise would now be as old as we've known how to measure a circle, as old as cotton, as old as the third dynasty of Ur. It's not like waiting for Christmas morning to arrive. It's waiting a long, long time. Now you may be thinking, well, you said that this prophecy or this promise really exploded with King David, so that's only 1,000 years. So, I guess we could maybe write it out for 1,000 years. Well, that's when it exploded. That's not really when it originated. You can go back a long, long time before that. You can go all the way back to Adam and Eve. The promise of this individual is given to them when they are kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3:15. God makes a promise to them about the seed of this woman. Genesis 3:15, that he is going to crush the head of this serpent, the serpent that tempted Eve, the serpent that led them into sin and rebellion against God. This promised one, that's how big he's going to be. He's going to destroy the one who introduced you to sin. What's amazing is we make our way chronologically through the Old Testament. What begins as a whisper, an allusion to what this person is going to do, only alluding to the benefit that he would bring, gradually begins to build as more and more promises are revealed to God's people about what this individual is going to be and what he is going to do. And as the promises build, the need for this deliverer is magnified. So many things that he is going to do, so many promises that he is going to fulfill. And it's amplified because as more is revealed about this individual, the condition of God's people only deteriorates more and more and more. They go from being under God's care to being rebellious against him. You go through the book of Judges, there is this refrain again and again, and God raised up a deliverer. And God raised up a deliverer. And even though in the book of Judges, for example, there is no great promise about this one apex deliverer, what is made clear is that we need somebody to deliver us. And wouldn't it be great if there was somebody who could deliver us permanently? And then there's the hopes of this king under the United Monarchy, but none of the earthly kings ever deliver on this promise or live up to the expectations. And then from unity to division, from division to exile, and even in the return from exile, it is clear that things are not what they should be, and they're certainly not the way we want them to be. We need somebody to do something about all this. When is this person going to come? We've been promising, and everybody that we think we can hang our hopes on always fails to deliver. So we get to the New Testament. And you may be sitting there thinking, so what? I don't want a king. I'm pretty sure I don't want a priest. I'm not really sure what a prophet is. We haven't needed shepherds for a long time. You might say, and really all that aside, it seems like this big promise is really only for the Jewish people. They're the ones all the promises are given to. They seem to be the focus of it. He's going to deliver them. He's going to rule over them. He's going to be their king. He's going to be their priest. He's going to be their prophet. I'm not Jewish. What is he going to do for me? That is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. Unfortunately, we are out of time. And you are going to have to come back next week when we answer that question. And more importantly, we're going to answer the question, how can we be so certain that this person actually was Jesus? He might have been a prophet. I don't know. Pretty sure he wasn't a priest. Don't think he was a king. How can I really know that Jesus is and was this promised deliverer? That's what we're going to focus on next week. as we continue to think about this idea of anticipation. What are we waiting for? And how long are we willing to wait? Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for the continuity of your word. We thank you for the way in which you have laid out your revelation of yourself and of your plan for us, piece by piece, little by little, leading us to one exclusive conclusion. There's really only one answer. We thank you that your word supports the truth of your plan, reveals to us that it has been the plan all along, that you haven't been sort of modifying and making spontaneous adjustments on the fly. But the way that history has unfolded and the way that you have worked within history as it unfolded is how you have intended to work from the very beginning. As we continue to consider the idea of anticipation of this promised deliverer, may it serve to solidify in our minds the fact that Jesus Christ is the one and only who can deliver us from all of our problems, satisfy all of our needs, and bring us into a place of being in a relationship with you in anticipation of a glorious eternal future. We ask that you would help us to think deeply about these things throughout the week in anticipation of coming back again and talking some more. We ask all this in your name. Amen. Well, thank you so much. Don't forget teachers about teachers meeting after the service. Is that going to be in the fellowship hall or in the CE wing? It'll be over in the CE wing. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful Sunday.